In 2012, the family of one of the richest people in Brazil, businessman Marcos Matsunaga, became the center of attention after Marcos disappeared on the eve of a major billion-dollar deal. The case shocked the whole country, and photos of the inconsolable widow of the millionaire did not leave the front pages of the leading national publications. Initially, as the main version, the police considered the intrigues of competitors who could kidnap and get rid of the businessman in order to disrupt the upcoming deal. However, the revealed truth turned out to be much more cruel and terrible. The story of a cold-blooded murder and a monstrous attempt to cover up the crime formed the basis of several documentaries. Who is Marcos Matsunaga? Entrepreneur Marcos Matsunaga was one of the richest people in Brazil and ran a family business producing various food products, Yoki. The company was founded by Marcos's grandfather, who had once emigrated across the ocean. His name was Yoshizo Kitano, actually, from the first letters of the surname and first name of the founder, and the name of the brand was formed. The foundation of the future business empire was laid in the middle of the last century. It is noteworthy that it all started with a small flour milling enterprise, which managed not only to survive, but also thrive during the years of crisis and war, and then transformed into a huge company with a worldwide reputation and the widest range of products. Marcos was born into a wealthy family, and from an early age he knew no denial of anything. He did not have to build and develop his business from scratch, because he inherited everything that his grandfather and father had created, becoming the CEO of the family food company. He had every chance to become the first billionaire in his family, and he strived for this almost all his conscious life, but such grandiose plans were not destined to materialize. Everyone who was personally acquainted with Marcos characterized him as a good and quite talented businessman, who managed not only to save, but also to multiply the family capital, several times increasing profits. But he was not an easy man. Capricious, arrogant, with a heavy character, and a constant desire to control everyone who was near him. In addition, the businessman was far from handsome in appearance. He suffered from childhood overweight, had problems with vision, because of which he wore glasses, and he was also short in stature and somewhat clumsy. All this from an early age created a lot of problems for the boy when communicating with his peers. He had almost no friends and female representatives of the female sex, and it all shunned this strange and peculiar guy. Marcos, for a long time, all failed to build a long and serious relationship with anyone, because beyond a couple of dates, it did not go. Even his own business and multi-million-dollar inheritance did not make him an enviable and desirable bachelor. He repulsed women with his arrogance and egoism, so Marcos often used the services of escorts and representatives of the ancient profession. There is practically no information about the entrepreneur's first wife in open sources. It is only known that he did not marry out of great love or passion, but rather out of desperation and at the insistence of his relatives. Despite this, the marriage lasted several years, although both spouses almost immediately began to regret their decision to start a family. At first, the young wife tried to put up with the complex character of the businessman, hoping that in time they will manage to become a happy couple where both support and understand each other. But the young woman was wrong, and over the years they only increasingly distanced from each other. Also, Marcos constantly cheated on her and did not even try to hide it or somehow justify it. And he looked for mistresses mainly on websites where girls offered intimacy for money. Alice was one of those girls. She was an escort, and her portfolio was available on the relevant platforms. It was there that the businessman noticed a bright, attractive blonde with a beautiful figure and began to regularly invite her on dates, generously paying for them. Alice was 6 years younger than him. She was born and raised in a very poor and dysfunctional family living in one of the most crime-ridden areas of the city. Alice didn't know her own father. Her mother was a heavy drinker, and she was involved with men who shared her addiction. The girl had a hard and joyless childhood. At a very young age, she was repeatedly beaten, harassed, and abused by her mother's roommates. Barely finished school, Alice literally ran away from home and forever left the neighborhood in which she grew up. The girl took nursing courses, after which she got a job at a hospice. However, she soon realized that caring for dying patients is far from the limit of her dreams and abilities. In addition, sensitive and vulnerable young woman quickly became attached to people, and the death of each patient perceived as a personal tragedy. A few years later, Alice decided to get a higher education and completely change her occupation. Her choice fell on the law, which she considered a promising occupation, opening in life almost all the doors. She had long been preparing for admission and was able to score the required number of points in the entrance exams, but to pay for her studies from her modest salary as a nurse, she could not. Alice had no one to help her, because she had severed all ties with her relatives after she left home. Then, young, pretty Alice, with a slender figure, decided to earn on her external data and registered on a site specializing in the provision of escort services. There she was helped to create a bright personal page, and soon wealthy men themselves began to show interest in the young blonde beauty. Escorting and providing intimate services brought Alice a good income, allowing her to pay for her studies and fully support herself. But she planned to leave this specific occupation as soon as she got her diploma and got a job in her specialty. During this period, Alice met Marcos, who became one of her regular customers. He was generous with gifts and met regularly with Alice without hiding from anyone. She knew that the businessman was married, but at the time she couldn't have dreamed that one of the richest men in the country would leave his wife for her. The story of Elize Matsunaga was like a Cinderella tale. A poor girl from a disadvantaged family, engaged in providing escort services, meets a multi-millionaire who soon falls madly in love with her. Marcos really literally lost his head, but now it is impossible to say for sure whether Alice herself made efforts to do so. After about 6 months, Marcos realized that he wanted not just to date his new young mistress, but to be with her permanently. He, without a second thought and regret, filed for divorce from his first wife and began to present everyone Alice as his fiancée. For obvious reasons, the businessman did not want anyone to know about how he met his chosen one and what she earned a living. Therefore, the couple came up with a quite ordinary story of a casual acquaintance in a cafe and adhered to this version. Even the closest relatives and few friends of Marcos did not guess anything. However, Alice in the family Matsunaga received not too welcome. The parents of the entrepreneur guessed that this attractive young person put into action all her charm to fall in love with the rich but ugly Marcos. And now she was going to great lengths to pretend that she did not notice his hard character. Nevertheless, when Marcos announced his intention to divorce his first wife and marry Alice, no one strongly objected. The businessman arranged a lavish wedding in the traditional style, with a white dress, a large number of guests, and a huge tiered cake. After that, he moved his wife to his huge and luxurious mansion, where she became a full-fledged mistress. Matsunagi had long been known as an avid collector of expensive wines and rare weapons. For wines in his house was built a huge cellar, where the bottles were carefully sorted by year and country. And for weapons, the house had a secret room, on the walls of which from floor to ceiling flaunted firearms and edged weapons. Marcos was very proud of his collections and was constantly engaged in their replenishment. However, in addition, his house was literally full of antiques, luxury goods, and modern art, which tastelessly hung on the walls and stood literally on all surfaces. Soon after the wedding, the couple decided that they were ready to have an heir, but despite all their efforts, Alice for a long time did not get pregnant naturally. Then the couple decided to resort to the procedure of in vitro fertilization, but even here success awaited them far from immediately. When their common daughter was born, it seemed that the happiness of the couple now has no limits. The young parents were engaged in the education of the long-awaited baby girl, made plans for the future, and when the girl grew up a little, the whole family began to travel the world, getting acquainted with different cultures and traditions. Their daughter was a real little princess, who was brought up in love, care, and luxury. But the couple had one very specific common hobby: hunting large animals. Although it would be more correct to say that it was always a hobby of Marcos, who at different times tried to join it to his chosen women and his first wife. But most women did not just dislike this activity, it frankly repulsed them. The businessman no longer hoped that he would meet someone who would share his passion. Now many believe that Alice became interested in hunting to win even more favor Marcos and conquer his heart. At first, they visited shooting ranges together, where Alice learned how to handle different types of firearms, and afterward they went into the woods together to hunt wild animals. Alice felt no pity when she took the lives of animals and treated it as a kind of competition. Either you do it or you don't. Marcos liked this approach, and he liked to watch his wife handle her weapons and stalk her prey. He also taught her how to skin and carve wild boars, deer, and other forest creatures. Together they skinned them and separated body parts using large knives, special cleavers, and axes. In addition, the family did not have cats or dogs as pets, but poisonous snakes for which special terrariums were built, with conditions as close as possible to their natural habitat. It was the realization of another long-time dream of Marcos, who adored snakes, but his first wife did not approve of the idea of having a home terrarium. Alice had really bought Marcos off by sharing his rather strange hobbies. In the spring of 2012, the entrepreneur was preparing to make perhaps the main deal of his life and career, which would make him a billionaire and take his income to a whole new level. He was actively negotiating with several business partners, going to sell the family company, and the proceeds of the huge sum of money to invest in a new profitable business. At home at this time, Matsunaga rarely appeared because he was completely absorbed in work and the realization of his grandiose plans. He and his wife moved into an elite apartment complex located in the business center of the city, not far from the main office of the businessman's company. Marcos was away almost all the time, while his young wife was bored alone in a luxurious apartment with a panoramic view of the city. The businessman's work schedule was scheduled literally by the minute. He was lost in meetings, business meetings, and consultations with specialists. Often he did not even spend the night at home, but promised his wife that as soon as the deal was done, their lives would be completely changed and transformed. On May 19, 2012, on the eve of the deal for $1 billion, the entrepreneur disappeared without a trace. His wife reported the incident only the next day because she believed that Marcos at work. According to Alice, in the evening he was scheduled a meeting, which could last into the night, and early in the morning, her husband was to meet with a business partner, so he took some things, warned that, most likely to spend the night in the office, and then go straight to the deal. When the next day Marcos did not return home and stopped answering his phone, Alice became concerned and reported him missing. The police immediately found out that the entrepreneur did not show up for a meeting in the evening or an important meeting in the morning, which he simply could not miss. In this regard, there was immediately a version that the millionaire was kidnapped, and most likely, his family in the coming hours will receive ransom demands. But 24 hours passed. Then the second, no ransom demands were received, and hopes that Matsunaga was still alive were literally melting before our eyes. Investigators at this time did not sit idle and began to question relatives, friends, and business partners of the businessman, trying to find out whether he had enemies and who could be beneficial to his disappearance or the disruption of the upcoming deal. However, despite all efforts, it was not possible to find a specific person or people who might have wished the death of the businessman. He ran his business competently, was able to prioritize and plan his steps ahead so that his strategic decisions made almost everyone always benefited. A few days later, after taking her little daughter, Alice came to the home of her father-in-law and mother-in-law to tell what she had not dared to tell the police. The young woman with tears in her eyes said that her husband has long been cheating on her with a girl named Natasha Villarreal Lima and did not hide it. True, after several major quarrels and threats to divorce, Marcos promised that he would leave the mistress for the sake of preserving the family. In fact, the man did not stop meeting with Natasha, but began to do it more carefully, so as not to provoke another family scandals. The wife guessed everything and decided to hire a private detective to gather evidence of the businessman's infidelity. Alice had photographs and videos of her husband on romantic dates with the same Natasha. It was noteworthy that he took his new girlfriend to the same restaurants and entertainment venues that he and his wife frequented and where everyone knew him. Marcos seemed to demonstrate to others how much he disdained his wife and can openly cheat on her without hiding from anyone. As it later turned out, Natasha Lima businessman found on the same site escort services where he once met Alice. They met for about 5 months, and during that time he gave her an expensive car and also paid a large sum of money for Natasha to remove her profile from the site. The available photos and videos proving her husband's cheating, the daughter-in-law presented to Marcos's parents. She also added that she had shown all this to Marcos the day before his disappearance, but instead of making excuses and asking for forgiveness, he simply packed his things, told his wife that he was leaving her, and then left their apartment and disappeared without a trace. Based on Alice's story, her husband, giving in to passion, simply decided to run away with a new mistress. But everyone who knew Matsunaga unanimously asserted that he could not just leave the business and disappear because he was too serious about the business, which for decades built his family. Answers to many questions were found about a week later, when in a deserted area, 100 kilometers from the house of the businessman, a passerby found scattered garbage bags, inside which were the remains of a human body. The man immediately reported the gruesome discovery to the police, and it soon became clear that the victim was Marcus Matsunaga, who was searched for all over the country. Experts determined that the businessman was killed by a shot to the head, after which his body was dismembered, packed into garbage bags, and taken to the outskirts of the city. It was noteworthy that the murderer, according to the pathologists, was either a surgeon or an experienced butcher who was proficient with a carving knife. Such a conclusion was inevitable, based on how accurately and professionally the cuts were made in the right places to separate the body parts from each other. At the first stage of the investigation did not have any concrete leads, so it was decided to start the investigation from the place where the deceased man was last seen alive. Elite residential complex where Marcos lived with his wife and daughter was equipped with numerous video surveillance cameras, the records of which began to be scrutinized. It turned out that the evening before the disappearance, the couple ordered food delivery home. On the recordings of the camera in the elevator was seen as Marcos goes down to the first floor and then comes back with boxes of pizza in his hands. He enters his apartment and never leaves it again, not that evening, not at night, and not the next day. Matsunagi seems to disappear into his own home, but in the morning his wife leaves the apartment with 3 large wheeled suitcases. The footage shows that the suitcases are very heavy, and she moves them with great difficulty. The investigators had already guessed what kind of luggage it was. On the same day, the businessman's widow was taken into custody and brought to the police station to testify. At first, she tried to deny everything and stuck to the initial version that her husband had left her for a mistress. But when she was shown the elevator footage, she burst into tears and started talking. According to Alice, their family life has long since broken down, and from the former idol is not left a trace. Her husband humiliated her, constantly reproached her with the work in the escort, saying that he pulled her out of the mud and also stated that she was a bad mother for their daughter. He also tried to control literally every move his wife made, not allowing her to make friends. When Alice once raised the topic of divorce, Marcos laughed and replied that he would leave her with nothing, take the child, and forbid her to see him. Alice said that on that fateful evening she showed her husband received from the detective pictures, which were captured Marcos with his mistress, but he only made him angry. He slapped his wife, and then, according to her, everything was as if in a fog. Alice does not remember how she got a gun in her hands, from which she shot her husband, and later, realizing what had happened, she decided to dispose of the body, making it look as if he disappeared without a trace. Alice had experience as a nurse and was familiar with human anatomy, and her husband had taught her how to skin and cut up animal carcasses, for which they had the necessary tools at home. All that followed was a matter of technique. While Alice was cutting up and bagging her husband's body, their young daughter was sleeping peacefully in the next room. From the beginning, Alice's testimony raised many doubts and questions. In addition, it soon became clear that the very pictures and videos proving Marcos's cheating, his wife received from the hands of a private detective only on May 20th, that is, after she had killed her husband. Then, as I said, Alice took these photos and videos to the parents of the businessman, saying that Marcos had abandoned her by running away with his mistress. We also managed to find Natasha Lima, who appeared in court as a witness. According to her, Marcos himself wanted a divorce, but frankly afraid of his wife. saying that she was mentally unstable and capable of terrible things. The last time Natasha saw her lover the day before his disappearance, he complained about the constant scandals in the family and said that after the sale of the company is going to move to live in Florida, where he plans to establish a new company. Taking Alice with him was not part of his plans. He was going to divorce her and forget her like a terrible dream. Another terrible discovery was the discovery by experts of blood in the lungs of the dead man, which indicated that Marcos was still alive and trying to breathe when his wife separated his head from the body. This is wild and horrifying. Alice herself vehemently denied this, insisting that he died instantly from a bullet. The pathologist also found that the same bullet entered Marcos's head at a rather odd angle, as if he was sitting or lying down, not expecting to be shot. So he didn't even try to defend himself or dodge. This contradicted Alice's account of her husband attacking her and her trying to defend herself. On top of that, almost all the witnesses who testified at the trial denied that Matsunaga could have hit his wife. Yes, he had a difficult character, could say various hurtful words, but in life never raised a hand on anyone. Everything looked as if Alice herself made up this episode, because Marcos could not refute anything. As a result, the court found Alice guilty of premeditated murder with particular cruelty and attempting to conceal the crime. Elize Matsunaga was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which many considered an extremely lenient punishment for such a crime. The parents of the deceased man are now responsible for the upbringing of their daughter. In most cases, addiction is not a sentence, and many former alcoholics, for example, overcome their addiction, return to normal life, build families, and help others with similar problems to overcome the crisis. This is how the story of a young woman named Nicole Pitts began, who seemed to have a whole bright life ahead of her. The investigation in this difficult case lasted 6 years before the main suspect in the murder was in the dock, and another year it took to prove in court his guilt and send the criminal to prison for as long as possible. At first glance, this crime seemed perfectly planned and thought out down to the last detail, and the criminal himself for many years believed in his impunity and lived a full life, believing that he would never be brought to justice. But it was the little things and details, which the investigation for years collected in bits and pieces, helped to put the puzzle together. And now, let's try to make sense of this convoluted story from the beginning. Who is Nicole Pitts? Nicole Pitts was born in King County, Washington in 1973, on February 26th. She was the only common child of her parents, whose marriage broke up when the girl was still in high school. Nicole grew up an active and sociable child, played sports, and was considered a real charmer. She always had a lot of friends. She loved trips out of town to the countryside, and the favorite place of rest of the girl was Lake Sammamish, located east of Seattle, where she was every year during the summer vacations. After graduating from high school, the girl went to Western Washington College, where she studied public relations. In parallel, Nicole continued to actively participate in sports, was in excellent physical shape, and decided to turn her hobby into a source of profit. She got a job as a trainer at a local sports club, where she quickly gained the respect of her colleagues and also gained regular clients who willingly attended group classes, where Nicole was an instructor. In parallel, Pitts decided to get a higher education in the field of management, and after she got a job in a large mobile communications company. Outwardly, she was always friendly, sociable, and ready to help at any moment, but almost no one even guessed how much pain and misery was hidden behind a screen of apparent well-being, harmful addiction. As a teenager, Nicole experienced a serious crisis when her parents divorced. For a fragile yet to the end of the unformed psyche, it was a great shock, and rebellious character and bad company turned out that Nicole began to hide from problems, whoring them with alcohol. All this led to a serious addiction that lasted several years and thoroughly undermined Nicole's physical and mental health. At that time, Nicole's mother Gail worked as a stewardess and was almost constantly absent from home because of her busy work schedule, so she did not notice in time that something wrong was happening to her only daughter. The girl lived with an elderly grandmother, who also did not immediately realize that her granddaughter regularly consumes alcohol. When the truth was revealed, alcohol addiction has already managed to do irreparable damage. To cope with the problem, Nicole was helped by her mother, Gail, with whom they have always been very close, despite everything. She not only sent her daughter to therapy, but also attended AA meetings with her, helping her to open up and overcome her cravings for alcohol. By then, Gail had remarried, and her new boyfriend, Rod, was sympathetic. He supported her stepdaughter in every way possible, loved her like his own daughter, and believed that she could overcome her addiction. Nicole approached therapy responsibly, did not miss a single meeting, and quickly enough was able to overcome her addiction. However, as I said, alcohol took a toll on Nicole's health. She developed serious problems with her pancreas, so much so that she had to undergo surgery. But the worst thing, alcohol abuse at such a young age violated the reproductive functions of the body, so that Pitts could not have children. In the mid-90s, when Nicole overcame addiction and returned to a sober life, she met her future spouse, whose name was David. At that time, she just got a job at a sports club, and David was his regular visitor, Nicole. In turn, he also paid attention to the attractive coach and began to show interest in her. True, David was 4 years younger than Nicole, but the age difference did not embarrass them. Soon between them began a romantic relationship that lasted almost 8 years, and only in 2002 the couple married. They arranged a beautiful but modest wedding ceremony in Hawaii, to which were invited only the closest people to them. After the wedding, the newlyweds settled in the quiet town of Linwood, in Washington state, where they bought their own house and gradually settled down. Nicole was a very sociable and friendly young woman. She quickly made friends, and she also developed good relationships with all the neighbors. She simply adored animals and had several dogs. Since she could not have children, she gave all her unspent maternal love to her pets. According to neighbors' memories, David and Nicole looked like the perfect married couple. They were practically inseparable, often walking their dogs together and just glowing with happiness. Nicole loved to cook, and she was very good at it. She pampered a delicious home-cooked food spouse and also liked to surprise the guests who came to their house with her culinary skills. In 2006, just a few days before her 33rd birthday, Nicole mysteriously disappeared. On that day, for the first time, she did not come to the meeting of the AA Society, where she was the leader and inspirer of the group. Since this had never happened before, the other members of the group thought she had snapped after almost 9 years of sobriety. Pitts also didn't show up for work that day, which worried her co-workers, and in the evening the alarm was sounded by Gail, who couldn't contact her daughter all day, which had never happened before. She called David to find out what had happened, but her son-in-law replied that he couldn't reach his spouse either. According to her husband, he and Nicole had had a bit of a fight the day before, so when he tried to call her the next day and she didn't answer the phone, he assumed that Nicole was still mad at him. It was for this reason that David didn't start looking for her right away, but waited until the evening to ask his wife for forgiveness. When in the evening Nicole did not come home and her phone was still unanswered, the family decided to go to the police, but there their application was not immediately accepted. The missing person was an adult, and not even a day had passed since her disappearance, so the police said that there was no cause for concern. For this reason, the search was not started until the evening of the second day, because Nicole never showed up and her phone was unavailable. The police decided to start the search from the place where Nicole was last seen, namely from her and David's house. However, no clues or anything unusual could be found there that would indicate that Pitts had been kidnapped or something had been done to her in that very room. In addition, Pitts was missing along with her personal automobile, which suggested that she had simply left and decided not to return. From here arose the first version, according to which the young woman, after a family quarrel with her husband, simply decided to leave him or teach him a lesson, making him worry. The second version was voiced by Nicole's friends from a support group for people with alcohol addiction. In their opinion, Nicole could have snapped after years of abstinence and sobriety. In favor of this hypothesis was the fact that recently she had been taking strong painkillers, which she was prescribed because of a back injury and her pain. Nicole often exceeded her prescribed dosage and at some point may have switched from medication to alcohol. The third version was the worst of all possible options. Nicole did not return and did not give any news about herself because she was no longer alive. However, the family members of the missing person, to the end, refused to believe it and hoped for the best. Her mother and stepfather did not wait for the police to wait for the necessary time and began the search themselves. They appealed to all concerned people through social networks with a request to help in the search and share any relevant information about the location of their daughter. They also took the first flight to Linwood, where they began searching for their daughter on their own, putting up flyers with her photos and asking people who knew her personally. The police searched not only for Nicole, but also for her car, while trying to establish which route it had traveled on that fateful day. But the longer the search lasted, the faster the hope of finding Nicole alive had faded. The worst assumptions came true a few days later, when in one of the local park areas, a man going for a morning jog came across the body of a young woman. That day, he decided to take a shortcut through an unpopular and neglected area rather than his usual route. There, he noticed something strange in the shrubbery, and coming closer, he realized that it was a badly mutilated naked female body. Information about the terrible find was immediately transferred to the police, and the criminalists who arrived on the scene suggested that the crime may have involved violence, because the body of a young woman had no clothes. There was no doubt that it was a murder, and judging by the number of bruises, abrasions, and bruises, the victim had been severely beaten beforehand. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Nicole was strangled with her bare hands. It was a truly gruesome picture. As the car of the victim was still not found, investigators assumed that the main motive of the crime was theft. But the attacker decided to eliminate a witness, and since it was a young woman, she may also have been abused. The police immediately assumed that the body found belonged to Nicole Pitts, who had disappeared a few days ago and was being searched for all over the city, but she had yet to be identified by her family. When Gail saw her daughter's body in the morgue, she lost her senses. The mother needed medical help. Her husband Rod was also out of grief, but the reaction of the widowed spouse, many seemed a little strange. David did not look depressed at all, and his emotions were somewhat faked. However, then no one paid much attention to it because everyone experiences tragedy in his own way. While the search for the vehicle was underway, the police still believed that the car was the main target of the attacker, and the traces of the killer should be sought inside the car. Information about the missing car was placed in the media with a request to anyone who sees the car to immediately report it to the hotline. The car was found only a couple of weeks later in one of the parking lots on the outskirts of the city. The unremarkable gray Volkswagen Polo was noticed by the guard on duty because the car had not been taken away for a long time, but the guard had no idea that it was involved in a murder case. The police immediately took the car for detailed examination and necessary expertise. It was assumed that it was here that they would be able to find evidence and important clues that would help to trace the criminal, as well as to restore the picture of the crime. However, the investigators were completely disappointed. In the car could not be found exactly nothing. There was no blood, traces of struggle, or signs that the car owner was taken somewhere by force. In the cabin, there were fingerprints and traces of DNA only Nicole herself, as well as her husband, who also occasionally used the vehicle. Nevertheless, the investigators were not in a hurry to return the car to David because they felt that the evidence is there. They just do not lie on the surface. The irrefutable fact remained only that the young woman was killed with particular cruelty, but the motive of the crime was completely unclear. The hijacking version now seemed untenable because the car was abandoned almost immediately on the other side of the city, and there were no signs of struggle inside it. The second obvious motive was violence, but this assumption was not confirmed. Experts found that the deceased, at least a day before the crime, had no sexual contacts, neither voluntary nor forced. But in this case, the question remained open as to why she had no clothes on. The third version was some personal motive or acute, unpleasant feelings of the perpetrator towards the victim. In favor of this assumption spoke numerous injuries, inflicted as if in a fit of rage. However, the kind and sociable Nicole, eager to help everyone around her, had no enemies or ill-wishers. This difficult case had all chances to remain unsolved, because after almost a year, the investigation has no new leads or directions for the search for the criminal. No one saw the code, and who abandoned the car in the parking lot, because the place itself was not crowded, and there were no surveillance cameras in the area. But what was strange was that the person driving the car was much taller and larger than the victim, as evidenced by the position of the driver's seat. Suspicious was also the fact that the case was assigned the status of secrecy, and information about the course of the investigation, as well as about new facts and found evidence, was not disclosed even to the relatives of the victim. That is, the mother, stepfather, and husband, in fact, were in the dark. They received only fragmentary information, for example, that Nicole's bank card was used at a certain gas station in the country after her disappearance. The police requested the footage from the video cameras there, but what they saw on them remained a mystery. Nicole's parents, despairing that there were no results and their daughter's killer was still at large, decided to conduct an independent investigation on their own. To do this, they hired a private detective to gather all the information and verify some of their guesses, and announced a reward of $10,000 for those who provide any useful information on the subject. The reward was later increased to $35,000, but it still didn't help move the case forward. David only showed interest in the investigation for the first 6 months, but after that he gradually withdrew, stopped communicating with his mother-in-law and father-in-law, and soon remarried and had an heir. For Gail, this news was a heavy blow because her daughter could not have children, and David constantly reproached his wife for this. The grief-stricken mother repeatedly suggested that the culprit could be her son-in-law, but many believed that in her speaks resentment, and the police seemed not to consider such a version at all. An unexpected twist in the case. It wasn't until 6 years after the crime that it was revealed that David had been taken into custody as the prime suspect in the case. For most people who followed the investigation, such a turn was a complete surprise, but not for Nicole's family and friends, who from the beginning suspected him and openly talked about it. During the long years of investigation, they seemed disappointed in justice, but now justice had been served. David himself, who by that time had changed his place of residence and stopped contact with his first wife's family, was discouraged when the handcuffs were snapped on his wrists because he thought that the case had long been closed and no one was looking for the criminal. He categorically denied his guilt and even agreed to take a lie detector test, which he failed miserably. As it turned out, the police also from the beginning suspected David, but no hard evidence proving his guilt. They had no, and to scare the criminal and make him hide, they did not want to. So all these years, the investigators were busy with the fact that the pieces of evidence to collect, so that the culprit was deserved punishment. David himself probably thought he had committed the perfect crime and no one would ever get on his trail. However, the crime had a number of oddities, each of which had to be checked. Let's start, perhaps, with the surveillance footage at the same gas station, where someone paid with the card of the dead Nicole. The footage clearly showed that the card was used by a man who looked very much like David, but it was impossible to identify him clearly because of the presence of a headdress and dark glasses. Despite the fact that this recording could not be considered as incontrovertible evidence, it was still included in the case file. The second oddity was the absence of Nicole's wedding ring, without which she never left the house. At first, everyone thought that the jewelry was stolen by a criminal, but during the search in the victim's house, the ring was found in a box on the dressing table. In addition, experts criminalists, during the examination of the body, found in Nicole's mouth a special dental mouth guard, which she used during sleep to prevent bruxism, teeth grinding. Nicole had been prescribed this device shortly before the tragedy because she was experiencing uncontrollable spasms of her masticatory muscles due to nervousness, which in turn led to the erosion of enamel and chipping of teeth. This finding led the investigation to believe that the victim had been killed in her own bed while she was still asleep. This explained the lack of clothing on her, and the fact that the body was completely clean, and there were no signs of resistance. There was also no trace of makeup on Nicole's face, which she always carefully applied before leaving the house. About the mouthguard, by the way, David could simply forget, because his wife began to use it recently. In addition, experts have studied in detail and assessed the position of the driver's seat in the found car, finding that the anthropometric data of the last person who sat behind the wheel coincide with the data of the spouse of the murdered. In addition, in the car, as already mentioned, found fingerprints only David and Nicole. If a third person had been in the cabin, there would have been found his traces, and if he erased them, then erased traces and prints of the owners of the car. And one more important discovery was made thanks to the rapid development of technology. The perpetrator, after his crime, in an attempt to confuse the investigation, several times used the victim's phone in different parts of the city, but in the same places, and at the same time there was a signal from David's phone. As it turned out, David also had a motive, and in this perfect-looking family, a serious crisis was long overdue. While Nicole was studying hard, working 2 jobs, and helping people cope with their addiction, her husband led an idle lifestyle. He never held down a job for long, liked to spend time in bars and clubs where he spent his wife's earnings on booze and other women. Nicole always responded with an emphatic refusal, and once her husband tried to get her drunk to force her to do it. Gail knew about all the horrors that were going on in her daughter's family and tried to convince her to leave her husband, but she did not want to do it because she loved him and hoped that David would change. And after Nicole's mysterious death, her husband rushed to get a large insurance payment and immediately started a new affair. As it turned out, a few months before the tragedy, David, who had not been faithful before, had an affair with a girl named Jane. He spent time with her in bars and clubs while his wife was busy working or studying. Shortly before Nicole's birthday, he brought his mistress straight home, where they were caught by the suddenly returned Nicole. It was this circumstance that became the cause of that very family quarrel. Nicole told her mother about the incident, with whom she was very close, and a couple of days later she mysteriously disappeared. Since Gail was aware of everything that was going on, she suspected her son-in-law from the beginning. However, the police insisted that the evidence gathered was too little to send the suspect to jail. Then the case was classified, and the family stopped receiving any information about the investigation, and over the years, the parents lost all hope that the culprit will be punished. By the way, when David received an impressive insurance payout after his wife's death, he spent that money with Jane. Gail suggested that David's mistress could be an accomplice or inspirer of the crime, but she was only brought in as a witness because no evidence proving her involvement was found during the investigation. David appeared before the court in September 2013, but he continued to categorically deny his involvement in the tragedy. His defense lawyers initially insisted that all the evidence against their client was circumstantial and could not unequivocally prove his guilt. When it became apparent that there were too many incriminating factors, the defense changed tactics, trying to make David look like a victim. The story of pain pills that Nicole took after her back injury was brought up, and the lawyers also tried to convince the court that Nicole snapped and started drinking alcohol again, making her husband's life unbearable. But first, such claims were baseless, and everyone who knew Nicole confirmed this. And secondly, even if she had snapped, it would not have given David any right to kill his wife, and even with such cruelty. The guilt of the defendant was eventually fully proven, and for his crime he received the maximum possible sentence provided by the laws of the state in which the case was heard. David went to prison for 18 years. However, in 2025 he can count on parole after serving 2/3 of his sentence. The Rachel O'Reilly case, one of Ireland's most violent crimes. When a person disappears without a trace or dies in mysterious circumstances, usually the other half is among the main suspects. Unfortunately, in about 80% of cases, suspicions are justified. In such crimes, there is usually not even a clear motive, and the crime itself has been defined as domestic, as if it were something ordinary. In the early 2000s, the high-profile case of Rachel O'Reilly literally shocked the whole of Ireland with its unprecedented cruelty and cold-bloodedness. A young woman and mother of 2 young children was brutally murdered in her own home, and police officers who arrived on the scene admitted that they had never in their practice encountered such a horrific crime scene. To solve this mystery and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it took investigators several years of painstaking work. All this time, the criminal remained at large and was sure that his guilt no one and never prove. Perhaps it would have happened, but the killer was let down by his own vanity. Well, let's take the whole story from the beginning. Who was Rachel O'Reilly? Rachel O'Reilly, maiden name Callally, was born in 1974 on the northern outskirts of County Dublin, Ireland. His biological parents' girl did not know. At an early age, she was adopted by spouses Rose and Jim Callally, and she was brought up with 4 other adopted children of the couple. Their own heirs Rose and Jim could not have, so all their parental love without a trace gave foster children. From a small age, Rachel was an active and purposeful child. She studied well in school, played sports, helped her parents in the household, and never caused any problems. The girl grew up sociable, open, and incredibly kind. She easily got along with everyone and avoided any conflicts. As a teenager, Rachel was seriously engaged in softball, constantly took part in various competitions, and even set several local records. She also had a very strong bond with her foster mother, to whom she confided all her secrets and with whom she communicated constantly, even after she married and had children of her own. After graduating from high school, the girl enrolled in one of the local universities, deciding to get a degree in marketing. At the same time, she got a job as a salesperson in a city department store, and in her spare time, she continued to play sports, playing for the local team. Who is Joe O'Reilly? In fact, there is not much information about Joe O'Reilly's early life in public sources. He was famous for his inhumanity and extreme cruelty to his own spouse and the mother of his 2 children. But what kind of person he was as a young man is hardly ever talked about or remembered. It is known that Joe is also a native of County Dublin, where he was born in 1972 in a simple family. He was the second common child of his parents and was raised with his older sister. The children of the O'Reilly couple were not spoiled, and parents taught them that in life, everything should be achieved independently by their own efforts and hard work. The boy was quite tall, athletic, and was also fond of softball. After graduating from high school, he decided to study advertising by correspondence, and to earn a living, he got a job as a manager in a department store, the same department store where Rachel came a few months later. At the time of their first meeting, Joe was 19 years old, and Rachel was barely 17. The young man immediately noticed the new employee and took the initiative to be the first to meet her. Miniature smiling blonde, literally dizzy the guy's head, but only to go on a date with him. She, for some reason, categorically refused. Joe began to woo Rachel, said compliments, made little surprises in the form of flowers or chocolates at her workplace at the beginning of the day, but Rachel still remained cold to him. Desperate attempts to get the attention of the young saleswoman, with interest, watched almost the entire staff of the department store, and it even became a reason for jokes. However, Joe did not give up. He read Rachel's favorite book, so that they have a common topic for conversation. But it was only when Joe found out that Rachel was a serious softball player that things got off the ground. That's when he joined her at the stadium and walked onto the field during practice and joined the game. Since O'Reilly was long and familiar with softball, he showed all his skills and led the team to victory. This time, the young man managed to impress Rachel, and she finally agreed to go on a date with him. Their relationship developed rapidly, and Joe, by all means and available ways to show that he is ready for the beloved to literally roll mountains. He unexpectedly organized for his beloved a trip to the most romantic city in the world, Paris, and there, on top of the Eiffel Tower, he asked for her hand in marriage. Of course, Rachel could not resist, and answered him in agreement. Then the naive girl thought that she met a real prince from a magical fairy tale, with whom she will live a long and happy life. A few years later, the couple married, and then, one after the other, they had 2 sons in common. The couple moved to the quiet and picturesque Scottish province of Nahuel, where they purchased their own spacious, cozy home. It was the perfect place to raise their children. After the birth of their eldest son, Rachel left her job and became a housewife, devoting herself to the care of her husband and child. And 2 years later, the couple had a second son. So the young mother was completely absorbed by the heirs, and the main gainer in the family was Joe, who got a job in an advertising agency as a specialist in outdoor advertising. Those who were personally acquainted with the head of the family described him as a confident, purposeful, and not devoid of charming man. At work, he proved himself as a responsible, qualified specialist, punctual, and attentive. He was the first to arrive at the office, and always stayed late if the situation required it. Joe also continued to be active in sports, often stopping by the gym before the workday began, and in his and his wife's house, there were several exercise machines and a set of dumbbells. Over time, when the boys grew up a little and began to attend kindergarten, Rachel, in order to have their own additional income, became a distributor for one of the popular cosmetics companies and also sold household goods. Such work allowed her to communicate more with neighbors, who spoke of her as a wonderful mother, a kind and open person. As time went on, Joe became less and less likely to come home. In fact, he came only to sleep, shower, and change his clothes. This behavior he wrote off the total employment at work and the upcoming promotion, which he was so looking forward to. His wife supported him as best she could, but gradually they began to drift apart, and family relations deteriorated markedly. In the summer of 2004, there was one extremely unpleasant event. An anonymous person sent a letter to Child Protective Services, which stated that Rachel is a bad mother and mistreats her sons, who at that time were 4 and 2 years old. In this regard, a special commission visited the couple's home and responded to the disturbing report. Although nothing suspicious was found, and all relatives and neighbors described Mrs. O'Reilly as a loving and caring mother, the letter cast a shadow on her reputation. What happened to Rachel O'Reilly? The morning of Monday, October 4th, 2004, began as usual. The head of the family left the house at dawn, while his wife and sons were still asleep, and went to work. Throughout the day, he texted and called his wife several times, but there was no answer. Then he called his home phone, but the answering machine went off, and Joe said in a shaky voice that he was very worried and asked his wife to call him back as soon as possible. In the afternoon, Joe received a call from the kindergarten teacher saying that Rachel had not come to pick up the boys, which had never happened before. Then Joe called his mother-in-law and asked if she knew where Rachel was, and when she said no, he asked Rose to go to their house and see if everything was all right. In the meantime, he went to the kindergarten to pick up the children. When Rose arrived at her daughter's home, she saw her car in the yard and realized that Rachel was home. However, the room itself was dark and quiet, and no one answered her call. The first thing that caught Rose's eye was the clutter, as if the house had been searched for something. Cabinets and drawers were open, their contents strewn on the floor. The whole thing looked like a robbery. The landlady was nowhere to be found, but when her mother entered the bedroom, a horrifying picture appeared before her eyes. Rachel was lying on the floor in a huge pool of her own blood. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, furniture, and even the ceiling. And through Rachel's bloody, tangled hair, in some places the bare bones of her skull could be seen. Rose rushed to her daughter, hoping she was still alive and could be helped, but when she touched her arm, she felt the limb was cold and stiff. Rachel had been dead for hours, and there was no way to help her. Unable to remember herself, Rose started screaming and calling for help, and then rushed to the phone to call the police. At her screams, the neighbors, among whom was a doctor, came running. He was the first to examine the body and confirmed that Rachel could not be helped. When Joe arrived at the house, there was already a crowd of people there. When he learned that his spouse was dead, he screamed and ran inside, saying he didn't believe it. In the bedroom, by his wife's body, he became hysterical. O'Reilly cried, screamed, and promised to kill whoever had done this to his beloved wife. According to police officers who arrived on the scene, they have never seen a more brutal picture of the massacre of a defenseless woman in their practice. Obviously, the weapon of the crime was some heavy blunt object, which Rachel was beaten with incredible ferocity. There's literally nothing left on her body. Apparently, the owner of the house was attacked from behind because she did not even try to resist or fight back. The overall picture really resembled a robbery, but professional instinct told the investigators that such a beating only with personal motives or acute dislike. But who would have a hand on a petite young woman and mother of 2 children? The first thing detectives did was to interview family members and neighbors of the deceased. All of them confidently stated that Rachel had no enemies or ill-wishers, and that she was on friendly terms with everyone. Neighbors on that day did not notice anything suspicious, no strange cars or any strangers near the victim's house. Joe stated that he had been at the bus depot on the other side of town most of the day, where he had gone for work, and his alibi could be confirmed by a co-worker. The co-worker did confirm Joe's words, but the police were still haunted by vague doubts. Something was definitely wrong here. The situation looked like a robbery, but nothing of value had been taken, only scattered items. In the bedside table of the bedroom, almost in plain sight, lay €1,000, which remained untouched. Another stash was in a kitchen cupboard, but this too was untouched. There was also a jewelry box on the dressing table, but only a pair of chains and earrings were missing, lying separately in a drawer. In addition, according to the homeowner, a digital camera, silverware, and one of his dumbbells, which was probably the weapon of crime, were missing. It all seemed too strange. The house was turned upside down, the landlady brutally murdered, and all this over some little thing. Joe, answering police questions, was crying, shaking, and feverish, but as one of the investigators later admitted, it seemed to him that such a state of the guy was not grief or shock at all, but rather like nervous excitement. O'Reilly behaved even more strangely when asked if his wife might have had an affair on the side. Joe changed his face and confidently stated that there was no such thing, and then added that he had not cheated on his wife, but this phrase sounded very unconvincing. 2 miles from the scene of the crime, in the bushes, was found a bag with things missing from the house. Inside was a camera, silverware, and a couple of pieces of jewelry. All items were from the list of stolen items that Joe had compiled. Now the robbery theory could be dismissed completely, and the case could be reclassified as premeditated murder. Suspicious widower. In spite of all the widowed fellow's attempts to portray grief and pain, it looked fake, and he immediately became the main suspect. Joe had nothing to present yet, but the detectives had to check his alibi in detail to study the scene of the crime and learn about their relationship with his wife. Joe said that in the morning before work, he decided to stop by the gym, which he did regularly, and the surveillance cameras in the parking lot, as well as in the gym itself, confirmed it. He then drove to the office, and from there he went to a bus station in a remote part of the city in order to monitor the placement of advertisements on vehicles. His words were confirmed by a colleague with whom he allegedly called at the time. The investigators then went to Joe's workplace, where they seized his computer for inspection. This is where the most interesting part began, because the email contained strange correspondence, which Joe had partially deleted. Specialists were able to recover the deleted messages, and the police were finally convinced that they were going in the right direction. Most often, Joe corresponded with his friend and his own sister, and to both of them, he constantly complained about his wife. He wrote about Rachel using insults and profanity. He wrote that his wife had not attracted him as a woman for a long time, and in general, causes him outright disgust. Moreover, the computer found another curious correspondence between Joe and one of his colleagues, a woman named Nikki Pelly. From their communication, it was clear that these two were much closer than just friends, and they should both be questioned. Who's Nikki Pelly? Nikki also worked for an advertising company, and she and Joe had a lot of work-related interactions. The woman was 10 years older than Joe, but that didn't stop them from having an affair. When exactly began their workplace romance, it was not possible to establish, but it was at her Joe spent evenings and even nights, and his wife lied about the fact that too busy with work. But this was not the strangest thing in the discovered correspondence. It turned out that Joe had promised Nikki in his messages that they would soon be together. He, she, and their sons, referring to his children with Rachel. Such messages were more than suspicious because in the event of a divorce, the boys would be left to live with their mother. Joe, who initially claimed that he had no affairs on the side, realized that it was pointless to deny it, because irrefutable evidence of his infidelity was found. Then he admitted that he had indeed been secretly dating Nikki for a while, but then they allegedly broke up. For more than a week, the O'Reilly house was cordoned off as a crime scene, and no one was allowed in because the police needed to scrutinize and document everything. During this time, Joe was staying with his sister and the boys were staying with their grandparents. At the funeral, Joe didn't look like a grieving widower. He acted remarkably calm, and most importantly, as if he was shunning the coffin with his late wife. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he did so quickly, coldly, and as he left, he indifferently said that the coffin could be closed and buried. When the family was allowed to return home, everything there looked as it had on the day of the crime, except for the body on the floor. Joe asked his father-in-law and mother-in-law to go with him, and they agreed, figuring he needed the support. On the spot, however, the son-in-law suddenly began to speculate about how the killer might have dealt with Rachel. He walked around the room in which his wife had been murdered and described how she had been attacked, the force with which she had been struck, pointing each time to dried blood spatters. Joe then suggested that the perpetrator might have gone to the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands and the crime weapon, which he then took with him. His account was horrifyingly detailed and full of detail, with Joe also waving his arms around to mimic the blows. However, his grief-stricken parents wrote off his behavior as an attempt to relieve stress and talk it out. Although Rose later admitted that all this time, she did not let go of the idea that the son-in-law repeats the actions committed by him earlier, and it was he who massacred their daughter. Thirst for fame. Almost immediately after the funeral, O'Reilly began to actively communicate with the press, giving interviews left and right. He willingly invited reporters to his home, literally arranging them tours of the scene of the crime, and described how everything happened. At the same time, Joe every time on camera addressed the criminal, offering him to voluntarily surrender to the police. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the loved ones of the deceased agreed to participate in the shooting of a TV program devoted to this crime. But if Rachel's parents were depressed and literally killed by grief, then Joe on the set behaved as if he was a star. He vividly communicated with the makeup artists, interested in how he will look like in the frame, and in the breaks eagerly nibbled on the proposed treats, drinking their coffee. The police, who were still looking at Joe, decided to follow him, and found that from the set he went straight to his mistress, Nikki, who spent the night. By that time, the last doubts that he was the killer had already been dispelled, and it remained only to collect irrefutable evidence for the court. Gathering evidence was a very long, complicated, and painstaking process because the most important thing, the instrument of the crime, was not found. Nevertheless, there was enough other evidence. The first to speak were Nikki and the colleague who had confirmed Joe's alibi. They were both facing jail time for perjury, so they decided not to risk their freedom. Nikki admitted that she and Joe had not broken up at all, as they claimed earlier, but continued their relationship. Moreover, about their connection found out Rachel, because of which the spouses had a big scandal on the eve of the tragedy. The colleague, however, said that he was not sure whether Joe was at the time of his wife's murder at the bus station on the other side of the city. The guy simply confirmed his friend's words at his request, not knowing at the time that O'Reilly was a suspect in the crime. Recovered correspondence from Joe's computer, in which he insulted his wife and planned his future with his mistress and children, was also attached to the case. The police also examined numerous interviews with Joe and footage from the TV program and concluded that he described the crime in the kind of detail that only a criminal could know. In part, it was the widower's careless remarks that made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of the crime. In the morning, he really went to the gym, deliberately getting into the lenses of all the cameras there. Then he also warned his colleagues that he would be absent from the office because he would leave for work in another part of the city and his phone may not be available. Then he went not to the bus station, as he said, but to his home, where he armed himself with a dumbbell and hid in the marital bedroom, waiting for his wife, who had left to take the children to kindergarten. He attacked her suddenly, from behind, leaving no chance of escape. After the massacre, Joe, as he himself admitted, washed off the blood from himself and the murder weapon in the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom. The perpetrator then changed his clothes, scattered his belongings around the house to simulate a robbery, and went to work. On the way, he threw the items away and disposed of the soiled clothes and dumbbells so that they would not be found. He also thoughtfully called his already murdered wife's cell phone several times, sent her a couple of messages and recorded voicemails on the answering machine, asking her to call him back. In the office, he was acting strangely and looked overexcited, and his hands were shaking slightly. Some of his colleagues noticed this and asked if he was all right. But Joe was confused, and instead of answering, he hurried to his office, where he soon received a call from the daycare center, informing him that the boys had not been picked up. He did not hurry to go home, but instead sent his mother-in-law to be the first to find his daughter's disfigured body. He thought he had thought of everything, and that his guilt would be impossible to prove, but his thirst for fame and public attention played against him. Joe was not taken into custody until 2 years after his crime. Despite the fact that most of the evidence was circumstantial, Joe's guilt was proved by reconstructing the entire route of his movements that day on the signal of a cell phone, with which he did not part. It is noteworthy that at the time of Rachel's murder, Joe's cell phone signal came from the family home. It was verified later with the help of billing. In addition, it was revealed at trial that the anonymous letter to Child Protective Services was written by Joe's mother at the request of her son. Joe knew that he would not have sole custody of the boys in the event of a divorce, so he tried to smear his wife by making her look like a bad and abusive mother. But social services officials found no corroboration for what the anonymous message said, so O'Reilly decided to act for sure. He felt no remorse. He smiled in the courtroom, talked animatedly with his defense attorneys, and even tried to joke, believing that he would be released anyway. But in the summer of 2007, the court found Joe guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The lawyers tried to challenge this decision, but all their complaints and appeals were rejected. It is noteworthy that the relationship between Joe and Nikki continued even after the guy went to prison. His mistress visited him regularly for many years, but in 2022, for unknown reasons, they stopped communicating. Joe O'Reilly never pleaded guilty. In prison, he has become a model inmate who never causes any trouble, hoping to achieve parole eligibility one day.